In 2024, the global podcast industry crossed $4 billion in annual revenue. $4 billion. And less than 15 years ago, almost nobody had even heard the word podcast. That is not a slow burn success story. That is one of the fastest industry explosions in the history of media. And the way it happened will genuinely change how you think about attention, money, and the future of entertainment. So what actually drove this? In the next 10 minutes, you are going to discover exactly how a niche tech hobby transformed into a financial juggernaut. You will learn about the pivotal moments that unlocked advertiser money, the surprising players who bet everything on audio, and the one counterintuitive truth about why podcasting succeeded precisely because it was not trying to compete with anything. There is a twist in this story that most people never see coming. Stick around because it reframes the entire industry. Let us go back to the beginning. The word podcast was coined in 2004 by journalist Ben Hammersley in a Guardian article. He was brainstorming names for this new phenomenon of downloadable audio files that people were subscribing to through RSS feeds. He threw out a few options. Podcast stuck. But the concept had technically existed before the name did. Audio bloggers and hobbyist broadcasters had been distributing audio files online since the early 2000s. The infrastructure was clunky, the audience was tiny, and the content was almost entirely personal passion projects. Nobody was making money. Nobody expected to. Then Apple did something that changed everything. In June 2005, Apple integrated a podcast directory directly into iTunes. Overnight, the barrier to discovery collapsed. Regular people who had never heard of RSS feeds could now find and subscribe to audio shows with a few clicks. Within 2 days of launch, over 1 million people subscribed to podcasts through iTunes. That number jumped to 1 million new podcast subscriptions per day within months. Apple had not created podcasting. They had just handed it a megaphone. And the world answered. But here is what nobody talks about. Apple never made a single dollar from podcasting. They built the infrastructure, hosted the directory, and drove the adoption. All for free. For over a decade. No subscription fees. No advertising cut. Just a platform sitting there, growing an industry that Apple itself would not monetize. That decision created an open ecosystem where anyone could publish and anyone could listen without a gatekeeper taking a toll. And that openness is exactly why the industry exploded the way it did. Throughout the late 2000s and early 2010s, podcasting grew steadily but quietly. Shows like This American Life expanded their radio audience into podcast downloads. Marc Maron launched WTF with Marc Maron in 2009 from his garage. Adam Carolla built what was briefly the most downloaded podcast in the world from essentially nothing. These were scrappy operations running on passion and small but loyal audiences. Advertising existed, but it was primitive. A host would read a promo for a mattress company. Listeners would use a promo code. Someone would track the conversions. It worked just well enough to keep the lights on. The real tipping point came in October 2014. Serial, produced by Sarah Koenig and the team behind This American Life, launched its first season. It was a true crime narrative investigating a real murder case from 1999. Nothing like it had existed in podcast form before. It hit 5 million downloads faster than any podcast in history at that point. It crossed 40 million downloads by the end of its first season. It won a Peabody Award. It was covered by the New York Times, NPR, and late-night television. Serial did not just succeed. It made podcasting culturally legitimate. Advertisers who had been watching from a distance suddenly started paying attention. Here is a number that tells the whole story of what happened next. In 2015, U.S. podcast advertising revenue was estimated at just under $175 million. By 2023, that number had grown to over $2 billion in the United States alone. That is roughly a 12-fold increase in 8 years. What changed? A few things all happened at once, and the combination was explosive. First, smartphones became the default listening device. The shift from desktop computers to mobile phones meant people could listen while commuting, exercising, cooking, and cleaning. Podcasting filled dead time in ways that video and text simply cannot. You cannot watch YouTube while driving. You cannot read an article while washing dishes. But you can absolutely listen. That portability unlocked an audience that no other media format could reach in quite the same way. Second, measurement got better. For years, advertisers were skeptical of podcasting because the data was murky. Download numbers did not tell you who listened, for how long, or whether they actually heard the ad. Dynamic ad insertion technology changed that. By 2017 and 2018, platforms could track listener behavior in much more granular ways. Suddenly, advertisers had the data they needed to justify bigger spending. The money followed the measurement. Third, and this is the part that really accelerated everything, Spotify made a series of massive bets starting in 2019. The Swedish streaming giant spent over $1 billion acquiring podcast companies including Gimlet Media, Anchor, and Parcast. Then in 2020, they signed Joe Rogan to an exclusive licensing deal reportedly worth $100 million. That single deal sent a signal to every media company, every venture capitalist, and every advertiser in the world. This is not a hobby industry anymore. This is a battleground for the future of audio media. Amazon bought Wondery for roughly $300 million in 2020. iHeartMedia, SiriusXM, and major radio conglomerates began acquiring podcast networks aggressively. The New York Times launched The Daily in 2017, which became the most downloaded podcast in the world with over 4 million listeners per day by 2020. Every legacy media brand suddenly needed a podcast strategy or it felt left behind. But here is what nobody talks about when they describe this gold rush. The vast majority of the billions being spent were not going to the millions of independent podcasters grinding it out in home studios. The money concentrated at the top with extraordinary speed. By 2022, the top 1% of podcasts accounted for roughly 99% of all podcast listens. The democratized media dream that made podcasting exciting in the first place started running directly into the economics of attention at scale. Getting heard became harder even as creating became easier. This tension is at the heart of where the industry is right now. The tools to create a professional quality podcast in 2024 cost under $200. Distribution is essentially free. But discoverability is brutally competitive. There are currently over 4 million podcast titles registered globally, though estimates suggest fewer than 300,000 of those have released an episode in the past 90 days. Most podcasts fail not from lack of quality but from lack of audience. An audience without backing is almost impossible to build quickly. The business model has also matured in ways that the early hosts could not have imagined. Subscription audio through platforms like Patreon, Substack, and Apple Podcasts subscriptions has created direct revenue streams outside of advertising. Some mid-size shows earn more from listener subscriptions than from ad deals. Live events have become meaningful revenue for established podcasters. Merchandise, book deals, speaking fees, and brand partnerships have turned successful podcasts into multimedia businesses where the show itself is just the centerpiece. The industry is also shifting toward video. The rise of YouTube as a podcast consumption platform has blurred the line between podcast and video show in ways that matter economically. When Joe Rogan posts his conversations to YouTube alongside Spotify, he is not just expanding his reach. He is accessing a completely different advertising ecosystem. The podcast of 2025 is increasingly a hybrid format that lives in audio feeds, video platforms, and short-form clips simultaneously. What does all of this mean for the next decade? Analysts project global podcast revenue could reach $25 billion by 2030. That growth will be driven by international expansion, particularly in India, Brazil, and Southeast Asia, where smartphone adoption and local language content are creating entirely new podcast markets from scratch. The English language dominance of the industry is already eroding as creators and advertisers in other languages recognize the same opportunity that Americans discovered in 2014. The story of podcasting is ultimately a story about trust. Listeners choose podcasts not just for information or entertainment, but for a sense of connection with a host they have heard hundreds of hours of. That intimacy is the product. That is why conversion rates for podcast advertising have consistently outperformed other digital formats. When someone you have listened to for 3 years recommends something, it does not feel like an ad. It feels like advice from a friend. And that kind of trust is worth billions. Before you go, if you learned something new today, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Subscribe to Trend Now Daily for a new video every single day. We will see you in the next one.